Hi, it's the Florida Law Guy. Today we're going to talk about plea forms. In order to plead guilty in the state of Florida, a person has to make their plea of guilty in writing. Then the judge will ask the defendant questions based upon that written plea form. A lot of defendants are very nervous, especially since the fact that it's in a public courtroom, which is normally jam-packed with a lot of people, and people normally don't like to talk in front of others, especially about their own personal lives when consequences so severe as entering a guilty plea are involved. Therefore, to make it easier for you, I decided to go through a sample plea form so that you have some sort of ideas what kind of questions the judge could ask before you have to go to court. Before a person is permitted to plead guilty or no contest in the state of Florida, the defendant is required to review and sign a written plea form with their attorney. The plea form contains the terms of the plea bargain that was worked out with the state attorney and also lists all of the rights the defendant is giving up in order to enter the plea. Once the defense attorney provides the court with a copy of this form, the judge will ask the defendant some basic questions. Now, each county uses slightly different generic plea forms. Some are more detailed and longer than others, but some are short and sweet. The longest and most detailed ones that I've seen are the ones they use in Pasco County felony cases, but most are much shorter. I recently represented a very notorious criminal by the name of Santa Claus, who was charged with burglary after being accused of breaking into people's homes on Christmas Eve by going down the chimney in order to steal milk and cookies from young children. Let's use his plea form as an example. On the plea form, Santa was allowed by the judge to enter a plea of no contest instead of guilty to the charge of burglary in the third degree. Now, the plea form contains a list of rights that are given up when a person pleads guilty or no contest. Criminal defendants have the right to a trial by jury. The defendant is entitled to be represented by a lawyer, and if they can't afford a lawyer, one will be appointed by the court. At trial, the defendant has the right to confront and cross-examine witnesses. The defendant has the right to subpoena witnesses and force them to attend the trial even if the witness doesn't want to show up. The defendant has the absolute right to testify at trial if they choose to testify, but the defendant also has the right to remain silent and not testify at trial, and the jury is told that that silence may not be used against the defendant. The defendant has the right to require the state to have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant also has the right to appeal a conviction after trial. However, when a person enters a plea of guilty or no contest, they waive or give up all of those rights except the right to appeal in a legal sentence. The judge, when accepting the plea, will summarize these rights and will then ask the defendant if they understand each of the rights they're giving up. In order for the court to accept the plea, the correct answer is yes, Your Honor. In order to prevent a defendant from getting railroaded by an incompetent or sleazy attorney, the judge will ask if the defendant's lawyer explains to the defendant the elements of the crime, any possible defenses to the charges, and the legally permissible range of sentencing that the judge could legally impose. Now, in this case, the judge could give Santa anything from 0 jail time up to a maximum of 5 years in prison. The judge will ask the defendant if they're satisfied with their attorney. Again, in order for the court to accept the plea, the only correct answer is yes, Your Honor. The plea form next informs defendants that it's impossible to calculate how many days a person will actually spend in jail because the calculations for early release for good behavior and gain time are determined by the Department of Corrections or the jail, not by the judge. The next part of the plea form shows specifically what the terms of the plea bargain actually are in this case. Because Santa had no record, he was receiving a withhold of adjudication, 2 years probation, 50 hours of community service where he would help elves make toys for poor children, and restitution of $1 for the milk and cookies that he allegedly stole, and of course court costs. Because the court must make a finding that the plea is being entered freely, knowingly, and voluntarily, the judge will ask if the defendant can read and write, how far they went to school, whether they are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or if they suffer from any mental or medical condition that could prevent them from being able to understand the terms of the plea or the rights that they're giving up. The judge will ask the defendant if the defendant is entering the plea freely and voluntarily, and if anyone threatened, coerced, or promised them anything in order to get him to enter the plea. The judge will not ask the defendant about their immigration status. However, the judge will inform the defendant that if they aren't a citizen, they could be subject to possible deportation. The judge also legally must inform defendants about the Jimmy Rice Act. Under the Jimmy Rice Act, if Santa had ever been convicted or entered a plea to a sexually motivated offense in his past, that plea could subject him to a civil commitment proceeding as a sexually violent predator. The defendant has to sign the form, and the lawyer then has to sign it, certifying that the attorney has reviewed the plea form with the defendant and that the attorney is unaware of any DNA or physical evidence that could prove the defendant's innocence. Once the judge determines that the defendant's plea is being entered freely and knowingly, and that the defendant had the right to competent counsel, the judge will then ask the state to provide a brief factual basis of the alleged crime. The judge will then impose sentencing consistent with the terms of the plea bargain. At that time, the bailiff will then fingerprint the defendant to make sure that the person entering the plea is the same person who was originally arrested. Hopefully, by understanding this process ahead of time, you may feel a little less nervous and a little less anxious if you ever have to stand before a judge in order to enter a plea in court. It's completely free, so please support my mission to help make Florida law simple for the public to understand by liking and clicking the subscribe button. The way YouTube's algorithms work, the more likes and subscriptions a channel gets, the easier it is for others to be able to find it. So by subscribing, you'll also be helping others. Thanks for watching. See you next time.